What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen Stallone. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Illumination Hour. Woo! I hope you're excited for today's episode. I certainly am, because I have got something very special planned for today. It's a little bit different than what we've been doing lately. It's not something that's so scientific. In fact, scientists haven't really been able to figure this out at all. What we know of this subject is very peripheral, and it's more of an interpretive sort of science, I guess. It's not exactly a science. It's just something that you feel, that you somehow know with a certain uniqueness that belongs to every person in a way that we can't exactly describe. Now, we all know that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but what is a sound worth? 10 words? 200? Or maybe it's worth something different entirely, something that we can't define with words. Something like an emotion or an impression. As you've probably guessed, what I'm going to be discussing today is the world of sound and music. And sound and music are related, of course, but they're two slightly different things. And I can't even begin to cover the entire depth of this topic. There's just too much that I could go into, but I really want to share with you today the immense wonder and pleasure that can be found in exploring our relationship with the world around us through these vibrational energies that we somehow pick up through our ear and interpret in our brain. And how we interpret sounds and music, it's different for everyone, which is an incredibly amazing and brilliant thing. But there are certain things, certain concepts that are almost universal when it comes to sound. So like I said, sound is only one of the ways that we interpret the world around us, but it's such an important part of our world. How much of our daily lives are influenced by sound? How much of our inner experience is influenced by sound? Now, this happens in many different ways. Sound is emotional. Sound is psychological. It can change the way we think cognitively, or it can change the way we behave. Sometimes you hear a really great song and you just want to get up and dance. But sounds are also statements. They say something to us, and they speak to us. Putting a series of sounds together can create something we refer to as music. And music is like a story, or perhaps it's the shifting moods that we experience throughout the day, or as we go through a certain range of motion. Maybe it's just focusing on one specific experience and expressing it without words. It's pretty incredible to think about, but sounds affect our perception of things. I know I've mentioned this before, but as you look at something, as it's happening, you may not be able to hear anything. Perhaps you're looking at a tree out the window, and you can see its leaves moving around, but you can still imagine the sound, the rustling, or the flapping of a bird's wings as it flies by. Sound affects our perception in that way. The intro song to a movie, depending on how it sounds, can change the entire mood as you go into it. For example, this soundtrack evokes a very different emotion than this one. Sounds can also bring to mind imagery. It's a certain innate understanding that most of us have. When you hear this sound, you imagine something plodding along in a kind of cartoonish way. Or what do you think of when you hear this sound? Putting enough sounds together can form movies or scenes without any words, without any visuals, without any cues except for the auditory ones. You can envision an entire scene being played out. A lot of this has to do with interpretation. As we receive this data, this information that's carried along in the sound waves that our ears can pick up, and then our brains try to unravel and understand, we put it together in this sort of way that we can understand. We try to put it together in a way that is coherent to us. We try to relate it to something that we already know. Now, it's easy enough to do that, but sometimes we can make it too easy for ourselves. Perhaps the way we interpret a sound or a piece of music is not exactly the way that the artist intended it, or maybe it is, but the creativity and the beauty that comes out of this interpretation is when we translate it into something that is entirely different. If you're trying to recreate a piece, you can do it in the humdrum musical writing exactly by the book style, or you can do it in a free-form, personal way. If you understand the meaning and the mood and all of the subtle undertones that are in a piece of music or in a sound, then you can recreate it with the same meaning still intact, even though the sounds have changed. One thing that I find incredibly fascinating about music is that you can interpret it in different ways if you listen with more than just your ears. I mean, everybody has a favorite song that they've heard 20 times. Every time it comes on the radio or you hear it playing, you can't help but sing along. You know it by heart. You know where the singer comes in, or you know when a particular instrument starts playing. And if you listen to it enough times, you can pick up on every single note of every single instrument if you have a fine-tuned ear. But if you listen with more than your ears, if you can actually feel the music, how it's affecting your body, the vibration in your skin, perhaps the motion of the artist as they're playing the musical instruments, you can perceive the music with a much broader vision. We can pick up intensity or subtlety. Perhaps there's a hidden meaning in the song that you didn't necessarily notice until you experienced it with more than just your ears. Sometimes sounds and music, they take time to get to know. They're almost like a person. You can look at them, and on the surface level, you can see characteristics, features, certain specific things, but you don't really know that person. You have to spend time with them and talk to them, give them a chance to express themselves fully, and then you can truly understand them. Doing the same thing with music will give you a broader, more enlightening experience of what the artist meant and what the song or the sound is really about. If you have a goal in your life to become more creative in new and exciting ways, then perhaps something that could help you would be to experiment, to be open-minded, to keep in mind different options and interpretations of things. if I asked you to recreate the sound of thunder using your hands, how would you do it? Would you sit in your seat and clap? Or would you take it a step further, get a little bit more creative with it? You could bang on wood floors or metal shelves. There are many different options for recreating sounds, and it's a fun exercise that you can use as a way to build your expressive and creative abilities. One of the most beautiful things about music is that it's a universal language. You don't need an interpreter to understand music. You hear it, you can feel it. In some sense, you can understand it. And maybe you can't put it into words exactly, but you can feel the angst or the joy. You can feel the sensations that the music is bringing. But of course, music can't tell you how to feel. It can't tell you what to think, though most people would say that it does. Music is more of a tool to help you understand a certain point of view. It has to be able to coax you into it. I can play for you a sound that I think is joyful. Or perhaps miserable. But the interesting thing is that you can hear these sounds and not feel the emotions so much as understand what they are. Because sounds are sort of like triggers. They can represent an emotion without actually placing it onto you. Unless, of course, it's played for long enough, or perhaps you're a sensitive person. You place a lot of value on listening and hearing beautiful things or effective emotional things. Sound waves are a carrier of information. They can give you any information that you might want, but it's up to you to receive and understand it in a way that is meaningful to you. Perhaps the message from the sender is also important or meaningful in some way, but the essence, the substance, the understanding, the value comes from within the receiver, you. Sound is so decisively influential in our lives because it has a massive effect on us as people in many different ways. It affects us cognitively, physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, and behaviorally. It affects us cognitively because as we hear music, we begin to think in a different way, in a way that sort of reflects or holds a mirror to the sounds around us. Because the sounds and the music in our lives creates an environment in which we live and absorb. We might not even be aware of it, but what you hear can, in effect, change what you think. That doesn't mean that it always does, but that there is the possibility that exists, that your cognitive direction can be swayed by what sounds are entering your head. Sound can also affect us physiologically because sounds are such an important part of the information that we receive about the world around us in the way that was meant to protect us from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, if you hear a sound like this, or like this, you feel more of an adrenaline rush or a negative feeling, something that's frightening or alerting. It raises your blood pressure, and it's meant to. But if you hear something like this, or perhaps like this, then you feel more at ease or soothed. It's a relaxing, happy sound. Music can also affect us psychologically because it puts us in different frames of mind. The way we view the world can be shifted by the music or the sounds that we hear. We can look at the world through a different window when we view scenes through this music. As opposed to this one. We can be affected emotionally as well. In a similar way that music affects our psychology, our emotions can be changed by the music we hear. I remember when I was a teenager, listening to music was so direly important to me every day. And it wasn't that I was seeking out new music exactly, it was that I wanted to hear the music that matched the way that I felt. So I would listen to angry music or sad music. Or perhaps on certain days I would listen to exhilarating, uplifting music. And I still do, but as I've grown older, I tend to lean more towards the happy side of the spectrum. But music is not only a channel for the artist to reach us, it's also a channel for us to reach people that feel or think the same things that we do. It's a way that helps us feel interconnected with those around us. We have someone to relate to or to look up to, and that makes us feel gratified. Even if the music we're listening to is a little depressing, but it could be any sort of emotion that you feel. Listening to that sort of music will give you a much-needed connection. Perhaps that's why people enjoy going to live concerts so much. Sounds and music also affect the way we behave, because we are drawn towards things that we want to hear or that we like hearing and are repulsed by things that we don't want to hear. Now, sometimes we're bombarded by sounds that are mostly accidental, like traffic or people talking and chatting in the supermarket. Sometimes, if we hear something that scrapes our eardrums the wrong way, we just get up and leave. Or maybe the song you're listening to touches your heart in a way that you've been wanting, that you've been needing all day. You've been stressed out working and you just want that release through that one song that you love. As soon as you hear it, that smile creeps across your face and you start bobbing up and down. Maybe you're dancing around the kitchen while you're putting away the dishes. But I think this, above all, is the most important thing that we have to understand, is that sounds and music can change the way that we feel, think, and behave, which is why it's paramount that we learn how to control the sounds that enter our lives. If you work in a busy, noisy space, you're not being as productive as you could be if you were wearing headphones listening to something a little more relaxing that will make you focus. If you live next to a noisy road and you're trying to fall asleep at night, hearing the sound of cars whizzing by and tractor trailers braking, that's not going to be relaxing. That's why earplugs come in handy. For as many sounds in our lives that are unpleasant, there are also the pleasant ones, the beautiful ones that sometimes we take for granted. For instance, the birds outside. Now, this has an interesting effect on our psychology. Humans have evolved to enjoy the song of birds because as long as the birds are singing, everything's safe. The birds fly away whenever there's trouble, as in a predator nearby or a storm on the rise. But just listening to their song can be soothing. This is an interesting piece from the composer John Luther Adams, who created this entire symphony based on the Song of Birds. Now, why did he do this? Was it because he felt soothed and relaxed by them? Or was it more than that? In his own words, it made him feel more at home. Now that's something I can relate to, is the feeling that I belong, or being at home, in nature, around the creatures that we evolved to be around and to listen to. Now, it's not possible to always control the things you hear, or to block out sounds that you don't want to hear, or only listen to things that will make you feel better. But there is a way that beauty can still be found in these sounds. Perhaps you hear a certain rhythm, or the tonality in someone's voice as they speak. The amazing thing about creative minds is that they can take simple things like that and turn it into a beautiful song, a story, a painting without words, without images, only sound. For this next part of the program, I'm going to be taking you on a journey back in time to learn about one of the greatest composers in history, Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, something amazing about Beethoven that you probably already know is that for the latter part of his life, he was deaf. You might ask, how can a composer, someone who writes music, be deaf? The story is one that's surely going to evoke some sort of sympathy, emotion, and wonder, amazement. Once I read this story, I felt incredibly inspired just by the skill, talent, and pervasiveness of the music that defined Beethoven's life. I want you to keep in mind while I'm telling you this story that Beethoven could not hear for part of his life, and that's important because he had the music within him. It was so firmly embedded in his personhood that he could not live without it. And for the entirety of his life, he couldn't relate to other people except through music, as you will soon see. The story comes from the Milton Cross Encyclopedia of the Great Composers and Their Music. Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany, December 16th, 1770. His birthplace at 20 Bonngasse in the Rhine city of Bonn is today a museum to which the music lovers of the world come to as a religious shrine. Here are kept many relics of his lifetime, including his piano, which is roped off to keep visitors from touching it. The temptation to touch piano keys once played upon by Beethoven is, however, something which few can resist. One woman hurriedly played the 8 notes of the first theme from the 5th Symphony, then turned sheepishly to the scowling caretaker. "I suppose," she said, "everybody just wants to play on Beethoven's piano." The caretaker answered, "Not everybody. Only last week we had a visitor who refused to put his hand on the instrument. He said he wasn't worthy of it. His name was Paderewski." A biographer of Beethoven cannot altogether free himself from a similar feeling of humility and reverence towards his subject. There was once an eccentric conductor by the name of Julien who had his own way of showing his worship. Each time he mounted the podium to perform a Beethoven work, he would have a pair of kid gloves brought to him on a silver platter. While the audience waited, he would put on these gloves with a great deal of ceremony and proceed to conduct the music with a special jeweled baton. Each one approaches Beethoven in his own way, though more usually with a simple veneration of a Paderewski than with the ostentation of a Julien. There are few composers who inspire the kind of awe that makes Wagner speak of Beethoven as a titan, and leads Tchaikovsky to call him a god. He inspires awe not only because of his stature as a composer, but also for his qualities as a man, his vision, sense of personal dignity, pride, idealism, and genuine heroism. Beethoven created some of the mightiest music conceived by men. He was also the central figure in a life and death struggle with destiny, from which he emerged triumphant. He had an unhappy childhood. His father Johann, a singer in the electoral chapel in Bonn, was a chronic drunkard who squandered the little he earned and who made his home sordid with drunken scenes. When the child Ludwig began to show an interest in music, the drunkard suddenly fired with ambition. Mozart had brought in a great deal of money as a child prodigy. Why not the young Beethoven also? Johann enlisted the service of his friend Tobias Pfeiffer to teach the boy the piano. With the tyranny of a despot, Johann kept his son at the piano hour after hour. There were times when Pfeiffer and Johann, arriving home late at night and drunk, would drag the boy out of his warm bed to make him practice until dawn. When there were mistakes, as there had to be when the boy grew tired and cold and sleepy, the blows would descend. It was a sad childhood. Poverty and drunkenness in the home, slavery at the piano until the muscles ached and the head swam with fatigue. There were blows for mistakes, but no kind words for a lesson well done. To make matters even worse, Beethoven had no friends, not even casual companions. He was an ugly boy, untidy in dress and appearance, clumsy in everything he did, extremely sensitive and shy. He was avoided by the children of his age, and he avoided them. Thus, he never knew the meaning of childhood play. Whatever warmth entered his life came from his mother, whose tenderness compensated somewhat for the father's brutality. She was a patient, understanding, compassionate woman who no one ever had seen smile. She no longer lived for herself, but for her children, and particularly for her oldest living son, Ludwig. Ludwig van Beethoven made his concert debut in his 8th year. His father advertised the boy was only 6. He revealed talent, but not enough talent to arouse his audience. Johann's maneuvers were not proceeding according to plan, but music study continued. Beethoven's first important teacher was the court organist Christian Gottlieb Neef, who understood him, appreciated him, and knew how to nurse his growing talent. At 14, Beethoven became Neef's assistant as court organist, filling this position so competently that there was talk of his replacing his master. He also served as cembalist at the court theater, assisting in the production of operas. Despite the lack of electrifying brilliance of such exploits as characterized Mozart's childhood, the discerning could recognize maturing ability. His teacher saw it, at any rate, for in 1783 Neef wrote, "If he goes on as he has begun, he will certainly become a second Mozart." His talent attracted the interest of the Elector, who generously provided Beethoven with funds to visit Vienna. There was good reason for Beethoven's desire to go there. It was a great center of music making. It was the home of the great Mozart, a musician Beethoven admired profoundly. To play for Mozart, to get the master's opinion of his talent, was his major ambition. In Vienna, Mozart listened politely to his playing, but did not appear to be greatly impressed. "Now," young Beethoven said, "I will improvise." Here he showed imagination and originality. But Mozart withheld words of praise until Beethoven had passed the severest test of all, spontaneous improvisation on a given theme. Mozart gave the theme. Beethoven improvised. At last, Mozart was convinced. "You will someday make a big noise in the world," he said to the young Beethoven. The news that his mother was dying of tuberculosis abruptly ended Beethoven's holiday after 2 months. He rushed back to Bonn in time to be at her side, and she passed away. Her death was a shattering blow. He lost the only one person close to him, the person who would give him tenderness and affection. Her death made his life at home more difficult than ever. His father, now a hopeless drunkard, once had to be rescued from the hands of the police. His intemperate drinking brought about his dismissal from the electoral chapel, and it was Ludwig's responsibility to support and run the household and see to it that his father kept out of trouble. To support the family, Ludwig played the viola in a theater orchestra, giving lessons to children of the nobility, and played the piano. He was also doing some composing, piano works which were not of any great consequence. However, people in Bonn began to speak well of his gifts and to prophesy a promising future for him. He made some good and powerful friends among the nobility, the Brunings, at whose home he got his first smattering of culture. Count Waldstein, later to become a patron, who was always ready with a sadly needed loan. In 1790, a celebrated musician passed through Bonn en route to London. He was Joseph Haydn of Vienna, considered by most of his contemporaries the greatest composer of his age. He stepped into the Bonn Cathedral to hear a new mass by the young Beethoven. "He is a man of great talent," Haydn said. Evidently, the great Haydn did not easily forget the impression that his music had made on him. Returning to Vienna from London, he once again stopped off at Bonn to meet the young composer personally. Beethoven showed him some of his compositions. "You have great talent," Haydn told him. "You must come to Vienna to study with me." Count Waldstein, informed of Haydn's visit, agreed that Beethoven's place was in Vienna, studying with the master. He arranged for Beethoven's salary from the electoral to be continued during an indefinite leave of absence, and sent the young man off with a loving and supportive message. In November of 1792, Beethoven came to Vienna for a second time, this time for good. Aware that life in a great city called for certain refinements, and eager to make a good impression, for there were many nobility living there to whom he bore letters of introduction, he bought himself a wig, silk hose, fashionable boots, and a handsome coat. He looked clumsy in all of his elegance, though, which, truth to tell, he soon discarded, and he behaved with awkwardness and self-consciousness of a small-town boy. He looked much older than his 22 years. He was short, stocky, and compact, with a face leonine in strength, but disfigured, pockmarked, and florid. Strength, crude and ungovernable strength, spoke through him. Few could sense that this was a new age arrived, the very spirit of the French Revolution. A greater, stronger, fiercer, nobler Figaro who had read Rousseau passionately. He was determined to make his mark as a musician, determined to study and learn as never before. With firmly set jaw, assertive chin, flaming eyes, announced silently that what he set out to do, he would do successfully. He did become a pupil of Haydn. Strangely, he did not do well. How, indeed, could the quiet, imperturbable Haydn, greatest spokesman of an age gone by, sit patiently and watch the untrammeled stormings of the young man whose talent he admired, but whose ungovernable genius he did not understand? Haydn was impatient with Beethoven's boorish manners and intolerable of the way the student broke the rules of harmony and form as freely as those of social behavior. Nor did Beethoven react more enthusiastically to his teacher. He found Haydn fussy, academic, too firmly rooted in tradition. Before long, they parted ways. Beethoven didn't stop, though. He sought out other teachers. Albrechtsberger of St. Stephen's Cathedral and the celebrated Kapellmeisters Salieri. But with these masters, too, he was an intractable pupil, and they could teach him little. "He has never learned anything," Albrechtsberger once remarked sadly, "and he can do nothing in decent style." Lesser men, more sympathetic and far-sighted, proved much more successful teachers. Men like Ignaz Schuppanzigh, later the founder of a great string quartet, and Johann Schenk. Meanwhile, the doors to Vienna's leading nobility were opened by Count Waldstein's letters of introduction. Prince Lichnowsky, Prince Lobkowitz, and Baron van Swieten were among those who welcomed him. Prince Lichnowsky, who recognized Beethoven's genius and even felt in awe of it, invited him to live in his palace. In the salons of Vienna's great, Beethoven played and taught the piano and introduced his compositions. Here he did not lack for appreciation. This is a tribute to the musical perceptiveness of these noblemen, for though Beethoven was writing in the styles of Mozart and Haydn, he was already asserting independence in his use of form and harmony. Besides, crude in his manners, so sensitive that the slightest affront aroused his violent temper, so conscious of his powers that he considered himself the proud equal of these noblemen and did not hesitate to say so, Beethoven was not easy to get along with. Once he insulted the guests in the Lichnowsky music room because they spoke while he was playing for them. "I shall not perform before such swine," he cried as he slammed the lid of the piano. The nobleman disregarded his ill-tempered remarks, tolerated his boorishness, and soothed his sensitive nature, because they admired his music so profoundly. In March of 1795, Beethoven made his first public appearances in Vienna at 2 charity concerts. Besides introducing his new piano concerto, the second in B-flat major, he improvised, astonishing the audience. Beethoven, darling of the nobility, was now admired by the Viennese music public as well. He was described by one person as the giant among pianoforte players. He was being acclaimed as a composer, too. By the end of the century, he had published a first set of trios, a number of piano sonatas, and a popular song, Adelaide. He was beset by commissions. "I have more orders than I can execute. I have 6 or 7 publishers for each one of my works, and could have more if I chose. No more bargaining. I name my terms, and they pay." On April 2nd of 1800, there took place in Vienna a concert for Beethoven's benefit in which 2 of his works were introduced, the Septet and the First Symphony. It cannot be said that Vienna, for all its enthusiasm for Beethoven, recognized the musical event as one of historical importance. The premiere of the First Symphony by the one destined to become the greatest symphonist of all. The performance was inadequate. The music was regarded as too difficult by the orchestra, which performed lackadaisically. The critics were devastating. In the opinion of one critic, there was too much use of the wind instruments, so much so that the music sounded as if it were written for a military band rather than for an orchestra. A Leipzig critic was even harsher, describing the work as the confused explosions of the presumptuous effrontery of a young man. Early in 1801, Beethoven began recognizing signs that he was growing deaf. Not to hear music any longer, not to hear that which he was putting down on paper. Surely this was the bitterest of all fates to befall a musician. Sorrowful resignation, Beethoven wrote at this time. In this must I find refuge. Sensitive about his oncoming deafness, he tried pathetically to conceal it, but he had to give up playing the piano in public, and had to keep aloof from the society of all who were not intimate friends. Deafness brought on a period of despair, a despair which he expressed in a remarkable document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, written in the Viennese suburb of Heiligenstadt in 1802, as an expression of his terrible anguish. O ye men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly you do me wrong, you who do not know the secret cause of my seeming. So began the tortured self-revelation. For me, there can be no recreation in the society of my fellows, refined intercourse, mutual exchange of thought. Only just as little as the greatest needs command may I mix with society. I must live like an exile, the document continued. And it ended. O Providence, grant me at last but one day of pure joy. It is so long since really joy echoed in my heart. Oh, when shall I feel it again in the temple of nature and men? Never? No. Oh, that would be too hard. Deafness sent him to composing music with a fever and passion he had not known before. Removed from the society of people, he sought communion with the spirit. Deaf to the sound of music only, he sought to put down the turbulent and majestic sounds he heard within himself. One masterpiece after another came from him. The Waldstein, Appassionata, and Moonlight Sonatas for the piano, the Eroica Symphony, the Kreutzer Sonata for violin and piano. As his deafness increased, he grew more irritable, scornful, sensitive, petulant, and irascible. His friend Ferdinand Ries had recorded how at a noonday meal at the Viennese tavern, Beethoven threw a dish of meat and gravy at a waiter who brought him the wrong order. An innocent incident might cause a rupture with the closest friend. From Hummel, he became estranged because he misinterpreted a casual remark and would permit no explanation to heal the breach. He drove away one of his dearest friends, Stefan von Breuning, for a mere trifle, and he did this after von Breuning had nursed him through a serious illness. More and more, he required those around him to believe as unquestioningly in himself as he did. With men who do not believe in me, I cannot and will not associate, he once told Prince Lobkowitz. He did find such men who clung to him, understood him, bore with him. They came back after each of his storms ready to give him their unselfish friendship. There were Prince Lobkowitz, Countess Erdödy, and most important of all, Archduke Rudolph, who could be tolerant even to his republican views. They loved him, tended to him as if he were a helpless child. They were also generous. In 1809, they arranged a decent annual pension for him. Withdrawing more and more from the society of men, Beethoven found solace in nature and in composition. He worked hard on his music, sketching, writing, revising, and always, always revising. To bring to life what he heard in his mind was a Herculean task to which he gave himself unsparingly. He knew his greatness. "With whom need I be afraid of measuring my strength?" he once asked proudly. He knew he was opening up new horizons with work like the Fifth Symphony and the Emperor Concerto. And his contemporaries recognized him as the greatest composer of the age. During the Congress of Vienna, when Europe's nobility and royalty streamed to Vienna to restore order to Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, Beethoven was the object of attention and admiration. Men of the highest station vied with one another to meet and entertain him. After 1812, Beethoven's genius entered a 5-year period of quiescence. He wrote little, and what he did write was without the old power and immensity. Beginning with the Hammer-Clavier Sonata for piano in 1818, the giant so long held in check stirred again. There now came the last productive period of his life. In some respects, it was the greatest of all. This was the period in which a spiritual radiance, rare even for him, entered his music. The period of the Ninth Symphony, the Missa Solemnis, and the last string quartets. Spiritual concepts were not all that concerned him during this period. At the same time that he was producing his last masterworks, he was also occupied with expensive and sordid court quarrels to gain the guardianship of his nephew. The suit finally ended in 1820, but it was hardly worth the effort it had cost. His nephew was lazy, dissolute, he piled up immense debts, and attempted suicide at one point. At last Beethoven was relieved of his burden when Karl found a niche for himself in the army. On May 7, 1824, in Vienna, Beethoven appeared on a public concert platform for the last time. The occasion was the premiere of his latest and last symphony, the Ninth. He insisted on conducting the performance even though by this time he was stone deaf. The audience was most enthusiastic, though the symphony was none too well performed. "Never in my life," recorded Schindler, Beethoven's friend and biographer, "did I hear such frenetic applause." Once the second movement was completely interrupted by applause, and there was a demand for a repetition. In the final movement, there took place an episode which surely must have brought tears to many eyes. The symphony ended, but Beethoven, who had heard nothing, and who was several measures off, continued conducting even as the applause erupted. At the last contralto, Caroline Unger walked over to the master and gently turned him around to the demonstrative audience. "His turning around," remarked Sir George Grove, "and the sudden conviction thereby forced on everybody that he had not done so before because he could not hear what was going on, acted like an electric shock on all present. A volcanic explosion of sympathy and admiration followed, which was repeated again and again, and seemed as if it would never end." In 1826, while visiting his brother, Beethoven caught a cold. Pneumonia set in, and after that, jaundice and dropsy. Confined to his bed as a complete invalid, Beethoven was cheered by gifts from different parts of Europe. On March 23, 1827, he signed his will. A day later, he submitted peacefully to the last sacrament. One day more, and he lapsed into unconsciousness. On March 26th, the Viennese heavens were split with lightning and growled with thunder. It was almost as if the city were giving voice to grief. A peal of thunder rumbled in Beethoven's bedroom. Ever the rebel, Beethoven feebly raised a defiant fist towards the heavens. Then he fell back, dead. All Vienna mourned. The schools were closed. Many people stayed away from work. Thousands lined the streets on March 29th to watch his body being carried away to its final resting place. I tell you all this to reveal to you what sort of a legacy Beethoven has left behind. It is sometimes said that the age produces the genius. This is undoubtedly true in the case of Beethoven. In no earlier era could he have asserted his creative ego so defiantly, broken so decisively with the past, and struck out in new directions with such independence. The spirit of the French Revolution had spread throughout Europe, stirring rebellion against the established authority. Crowns toppled, traditions were shattered, before the tidal wave of new ideas and the cry for political and intellectual freedom that stemmed from such philosophers of the Enlightenment as Rousseau and Voltaire. In keeping with this new spirit, Beethoven shook loose from the constrictions of the classical form and style, smashing those structural dikes that would have checked the surge of his inspiration. Creative necessity drove him to venture into dissonance, free tonality, enlargement of instrumental resources. In the last phase of his life, when he adopted musical thinking in form that were iconoclastic, he proved himself a true disciple of Rousseau, whom he read avidly. Freedom, the right of the creative ego to assert itself unhampered, was a religion with him. When he filled his music with a profound humanity, he was the son of the French Revolution, who believed passionately in the equality of man and who identified himself with mankind's struggles. I, too, am king, was his credo. One day, Beethoven and Goethe, walking along a street in Vienna, saw the Empress of Austria and her entourage approaching. When Goethe bared his head and stepped aside to let the royal party pass, Beethoven exclaimed, "Stay as you are, for it's they who must give way to us, not we to them." There are 3 clearly defined periods in Beethoven's creative evolution. In the first, roughly up to 1800, his compositions showed the heavy hand of authority and the past. These works, which include the first 2 piano concertos and the first few piano sonatas, sound as if they belong to the age of Haydn and Mozart. Here are the classical forms and style with an 18th century charm. But even in the music of this apprentice period, we can detect an occasional gesture of impatience with tradition. A shadow fell over Beethoven's second period. He had to face the fact that he was growing deaf. His music grew more intense, more personal, using deeper, darker notes. His form was more spacious. His harmonic and tonal writing more daring. "I am now making a fresh start," he wrote at this time, and proceeded to prove his point in masterworks like the Eroica Symphony and the Appassionata Sonata, considered by many to have heralded the birth of the Romantic era. Rules were radically altered, sometimes even dispensed with, to meet his artistic demands. Technique had to be extended. When Schuppanzeit came to him complaining that the violin part in one of Razumovsky's quartets was too difficult for performance, Beethoven shouted, "Does he really suppose I think of his puling little fingers when the spirit speaks to me and I compose something?" The structure of the symphony, concerto sonata, and quartet had to be amplified to give his ideas Lebensraum, which means a territory that a state or nation believes is needed for its natural development. The homeland where all life springs from. The harmonic vocabulary had to be enriched so that he could express feelings and ideas rarely before embraced by music. The poetic thought that Beethoven now brought to music's sound was something which nobody before him had realized in quite this way. As Paul Becker put it, music is no longer sonority, pure and simple. It contains abstract ideas. The idea determines the character of the world. After 1817, Beethoven entered upon an altogether new phase. It was his last period, that of the Ninth Symphony, the Missa Solemnis, and the final quartets. The break with the past was sharper than ever before. Beethoven entered spheres of expression previously unknown to music. With a new, subtle, and tenuous structural logic, he expounds a language daring for its modulations, progressions, and harmonic vocabulary. His thematic material becomes immensely varied, fertile, unorthodox in presentation and treatment. At times, his style becomes savage and brutal. At other times, he arrives at a spirituality in which his resignation to fate is complete, and he has found true peace at last. Obviously, Beethoven had a very strong will and influence over his music. As I mentioned earlier, music is a product of the culture into which it's born into. And maybe we don't appreciate it today the way that people did when they heard it for the first time in the 1800s. And yet, if you listen to it, you can feel and experience all of those things described about Beethoven in the songs. You can feel the strength, the power, the love, or maybe the anger, the misery, or the peace and the reckoning, the beauty in it. Whatever he meant to include in his music, we all have our own interpretations of it. We may experience similar feelings or emotions when we listen to the same song, but we all have different imagery that goes along with it. But it is the shared experience that is perhaps the most astonishing thing about music. The sympathetic vibrations are the resonance that we can all share when listening to something together and experiencing it and discussing it. Sometimes we have experiences like this even when talking about ideas, not involving music at all, but concepts, things that we share with other people, and then, as if by some strange extrasensory perception, we just feel that we're on the same wavelength, like we've implanted a thought or we've received one. Similar to how, if you can play a sound at the right tone, you can cause harmonic resonance within a glass, enough to make it shatter. Relating this back to people, I think this is part of the beauty that we can share in the experience of living with other people when we have a deep understanding of a person or a concept that they're trying to share. We feel a sympathetic vibration in a way. Even in that sense, life can be filled with the beauty of music. One of the most amazing things about Beethoven's story, I think, is that he was deaf for a large part of his career. Now, this speaks to me in a way that is thought-provoking. What this tells me is that you don't need to hear in order to experience sound. You can experience it in various other ways. In feeling, not only emotional, but also physical, as in the actual vibrations, or in thoughts. And if you're talented enough, you can reproduce the music in a way that other people can understand as well. Certain people and animals even use sound as a way to create another sense. For example, bats use sound as a way to navigate their world through echolocation. Also, while I was doing some research for this episode, I came across this interesting man who did a TED Talk. His name is Neil Harbisson. Now, the special thing about Neil is that he was born colorblind. He sees the world in grayscale. But with the help of some friends, he created a sort of cyborg eye connected to his brain. And whenever this camera picks up a wavelength of light, it transforms it into a sound. So, in effect, he's created a new sense. When he hears sounds, he actually imagines colors. His world is full of sounds and colorful music. He claims that he even dreams in sounds and colors now, whereas before, when he had no such external organ that could help him see, he dreamt completely in black and white. Now, this has transformed his life. He, in effect, has a new sense, and he's come up with all sorts of interesting ways to represent this for people, as in he's turned songs into paintings, or speeches, or even people's faces into sounds. That's just one incredible example, but sound does shape our lives in numerous ways, in ways that touch us on a much deeper level than even sight can. So I hope that all of you will keep that in mind and perhaps be more thoughtful when you listen to the world around you, or when you choose what you're going to hear through music, or even through podcasts, or through the people you spend time around, or what environment you put yourself in. Choose sounds that are going to be beneficial to you, that are going to help you focus or be productive, or be happy or uplifted, or something that you feel connected to in a way. If you start experimenting with it, maybe you'll find that sound actually changes your experience in a way that you never thought possible. I hope you all have enjoyed today's episode. You can email me with your thoughts, comments, and questions at illuminationhour@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next week.